There is a specific moment that happens in conversations you have been in many times. A moment where you realize that what you are actually thinking would take the conversation somewhere no one else seems ready to go. So you stay at the surface. And you drive home with the real conversation still unspoken inside you. That moment has a name, and it is not a problem. There is something you have carried since before you had words for it. A sense of being tuned to a slightly different frequency than the people around you. Not a dramatic difference, not the kind that announces itself or that others easily recognize and name. A quiet difference, persistent, running underneath everything. The sense that you perceive things others do not seem to perceive. That you feel things at a depth that the conversations available to you rarely touch. That you carry questions that the environments around you do not seem to find as urgent or as necessary as you find them. That something in you, something essential and foundational, does not quite correspond to the available molds. You have tried to fit, not out of cowardice, out of the deeply human desire to belong, to be received without having to explain or justify or reduce. You adopted the codes, you learned the languages, you participated in the dynamics, and sometimes you almost convinced yourself, you almost managed to believe that the difference was not as real as it felt. That if you tried just a little harder, you would eventually find your place in the available spaces. But the feeling always returned, persistent, inexplicable, like an interior signal that refused to be silenced, no matter how much noise of conformity you layered over it. And in the moments of greatest honesty with yourself, in those moments of silence where you could no longer avoid what you actually felt, you may have asked a question you have never asked out loud to most people. Is this difference a gift or a burden? Is it something to celebrate or something to heal? Is it the mark of something significant or simply a sign that you have not yet figured out how to be like everyone else? Chosen. I am speaking to you directly, not to a general audience. To you who are watching this video at this exact moment in your life. To you who know precisely which difference I am describing because you have been living with it long enough to have developed an elaborate system for managing it in public. This message exists to answer that question with a precision I hope reaches the deepest places where it lives in you. The difference you feel is not a defect. It is not a symptom of a problem to be solved. It is the mark of a destiny. And understanding why you always feel different changes everything about how you carry that difference and what you do with it. Let me describe with precision what it costs to carry this persistent difference in a world that rewards conformity. The first thing this difference produces is an exhaustion of adaptation. Because adapting constantly, in every space, with every group of people, is work. Invisible, unrecognized, uncompensated work. The work of reading the environment and calibrating your presence according to what that environment can receive. The work of filtering what you actually think and feel through the sieve of what is socially acceptable in that particular context. The work of smiling in the right way, laughing at the right moment, being interested in the right things, of performing a version of yourself that resembles closely enough what the environment expects for you to function without friction. This work is exhausting in a way that people who do not do it rarely fully understand. Because from the outside you seem perfectly well integrated, you seem comfortable, you seem present. The people around you do not see the effort because you have perfected it to the point where it no longer shows, but you know exactly what it costs. You know that when you return home after a day of this adaptation work, you do not simply need physical rest. You need to find yourself again, to reconnect with the version of you that has not been translated or filtered or adapted. The version that is simply you. Different, unexplained, perhaps misunderstood, but real. There is also something that this difference does in your deepest relationships. You can have sincere friends, people who genuinely love you and whom you genuinely love in return. But there is often an invisible limit in those relationships that you sense without being able to quite name. A place up to which the relationship can go, and beyond which something does not transfer, where your deepest thoughts find no echo, where your most important questions do not meet the same intensity of questioning. where the difference you feel internally creates a distance that neither you nor the other person quite knows how to bridge. And you can find yourself in relationships that are real and precious and genuinely loving, and still feel lonely in them in a way you cannot explain without seeming ungrateful or impossible to satisfy. Chosen. There is a final dimension of this wound I want to name, honestly, because it is the one that is least often spoken about in spiritual spaces, and yet is one of the most universally carried by those who live this experience. It is the temptation to pathologize your difference. In a world that now has many categories for explaining people who do not easily fit social norms, you can be tempted to look in those categories for the explanation of what you feel. And sometimes those categories are useful and accurate. But sometimes, and this is what this message is about, what you feel is not a dysfunction to diagnose, it is a destiny to discover. And the difference between those two readings of the same experience is absolutely decisive for what comes next in your life. Here is the truth that heaven wants to place in the deepest layer of your understanding today. You feel different because you are, and you are because you have been set apart for something specific. The Hebrew word kadash, often translated as holy or sacred in our Bibles, means literally separated, set apart, differentiated. In Jeremiah 1 verse 5, God says to the prophet, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born I consecrated you." The word translated as consecrated comes from that same root, set apart, differentiated, separated for a particular purpose. The difference Jeremiah felt was not accidental. It was not the result of a difficult personality or social maladjustment. It was the mark of his consecration, the visible sign of a divine separation for a specific calling. Your difference carries the same signature. It is not the result of dysfunction or maladjustment. It is the mark of a divine separation, the sign that something in you has been set apart, differentiated from the available norms, for a purpose that those norms could not contain. Here is the first truth I want to anchor in your understanding. The difference you feel is proportional to the specificity of your calling. The people whose calling is most specific, whose mission is most targeted, whose ministry requires the greatest precision, are often those who feel most different from the available norms, not because they are superior to others, but because what they were created for is specific enough to require a differentiation marked enough. A regular hammer can drive any nail, but a surgical instrument must be precisely differentiated from all other tools in order to accomplish what it was designed for. Oswald Chambers. This Scottish theologian, whose spiritual depth remains unmatched even a century after his death, wrote that God cannot fully use a person until that person has ceased trying to be like everyone else. Not because conformity is a sin, but because the specific calling God has placed on a particular life requires a differentiation that conformity would destroy. The pressure you feel to conform is not neutral. It is directed precisely against what makes you usable for the purpose for which you were created. Here is the second truth. What makes you difficult to integrate in ordinary spaces is precisely what makes you indispensable in extraordinary ones. The depth that seems excessive in superficial conversations is exactly what will be necessary in conversations that have the potential to change a life. The intensity that seems exhausting in ordinary group dynamics is exactly the level of engagement that crisis and transformation situations require. The way you perceive what others do not perceive, the nuances, the subtexts, the invisible dimensions of situations, is exactly the type of perception that people in their most difficult moments desperately need. In 1 Peter 2 verse 9, the apostle writes, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Read that description carefully. Chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation, his own possession. Every term emphasizes differentiation, the fact of having been separated, set apart, distinguished from what surrounds it. And that differentiation is not an end in itself, it serves a purpose. To proclaim the excellencies of God. The difference is in service of the mission. You are different because you have something to proclaim that only your difference enables you to proclaim. Here is the third truth, and this is the one I want you to carry as armor against the pressure of conformity. The pressure you feel to conform is always inversely proportional to the proximity of your deployment. The closer you come to the moment when your difference will be fully used, the closer you come to the spaces and people for which you were specifically created, the more intense the pressure to conform, to dilute yourself, to make yourself more similar to the available norms becomes, not because conformity would be better for you, but because something in the spiritual world understands that your difference deployed in the right spaces is a threat to everything that opposes the mission for which you were created. Charles Spurgeon, this 19th century British preacher whose sermons continue to be read and cited more than a century after his death, wrote that the people God has used most in history have almost universally been those who felt least adapted to the norms of their time. Not because inadaptation is in itself a virtue, but because the people whose difference resisted the pressure of conformity are those whose difference was sufficiently preserved to be used when the moment came. Chosen. My question for you today is this: in which area of your life do you feel the greatest pressure to conform right now? And what would be different if you could genuinely believe that the difference you feel in that area is precisely what God wants to use? Let that question find the places in you where the pressure to conform has been strongest, because those are the places where your most significant deployment is approaching. Let me show you what happens in a life when someone stops fighting their difference and begins to carry it with intention and confidence. The first transformation is in their relationship with belonging. Before this shift, for someone who has spent years trying to find belonging by conforming to available spaces, belonging is always conditional. It depends on the success of the adaptation, on the capacity to present a version of self sufficiently similar to the norms of the space to be accepted. And this conditional belonging, even when it succeeds superficially, always leaves a residual dissatisfaction because it is not the belonging of you, it is the belonging of the adapted version of you. When the difference is accepted and carried with intention, when you stop seeking belonging through conformity and begin seeking the spaces that can receive your difference, something changes fundamentally in the quality of the belonging you experience. You discover, perhaps for the first time truly, what it feels like to be received as you are, not despite your difference. Because of it, in spaces where your depth is a contribution rather than a problem, where your intensity is a resource rather than a burden, where your particular way of perceiving and thinking is welcomed with recognition rather than managed with caution. The second transformation is in their capacity to identify their tribe. Because people who have embraced their difference develop a particular ability to recognize others who carry the same mark. There is a way in which people whose difference is similar recognize each other, not necessarily because they are similar on the surface, but because they operate on the same interior frequency. And those recognitions, those moments where you meet someone and something in you says yes, this one understands, are among the most precious and nourishing experiences that life can offer to someone who has long carried their difference in solitude. The third transformation is in their relationship with their own history. Before having embraced their difference, before having understood that it was a mark of destiny rather than a defect to correct, most people in this situation read their history through the lens of maladjustment. Every moment where their difference created friction becomes additional evidence of the problem. Every environment that could not contain them becomes another failure to add to the list. After having embraced their difference, after having understood that every friction was the sign of a gap between their size and the size of the space rather than evidence of a defect, that same history reads completely differently. The environments that could not contain them are no longer failures. They are confirmations, additional evidence that what they were carrying was too large for those particular spaces, not because it was defective, but because it was dimensioned for something larger than what those spaces could offer. The fourth transformation, the deepest and most determining, is in their relationship with their own calling. because someone who has embraced their difference has access to a clarity about their calling that people who have spent their energy conforming do not have. The difference, once received and inhabited with intention rather than fought and suppressed, begins to function as a compass. It points toward what it was created for. It generates energy and clarity in directions that correspond to its nature, and resistance and fatigue in directions that do not correspond. And someone who has learned to read those signals, who has learned to trust their difference as a source of orientation rather than a source of shame, is someone who moves toward their destiny with a precision and a confidence that do not depend on external validations to be maintained, because they have found something more reliable than external validations. They have found the interior voice of their own difference, the voice that has always known, even when everything else was saying the contrary, that something in them was destined for something larger than the available norms, chosen. I want to finish with this. The difference you have carried since before you had words for it. This persistent sense of not quite corresponding to the available molds, of operating on a slightly different frequency, of perceiving and feeling and thinking in a way that ordinary spaces cannot always hold. This difference is not your burden, it is your gift, it is your mark, it is the signature of the one who created you with a precision and an intentionality that produced exactly what you are. Not an approximation, not a rough draft in need of correction, but the precise instrument that the specific missions for which you were created require. You do not have to keep apologizing for your difference. You do not have to keep translating it into more digestible versions for environments that do not have the capacity to receive it as it is. You do not have to keep spending the precious energy of your calling in the exhausting work of preemptive conformity. What you have to do, what this message is inviting you toward, is to begin carrying your difference with the confidence of someone who has understood that it is not accidental, who has understood that every aspect of what makes them difficult to integrate in ordinary spaces is precisely what makes them indispensable in the spaces for which they were created, who has understood that the pressure to conform is not an invitation to change. It is a confirmation that what they are represents a threat to everything that opposes what they were created for. Your differences are your gifts. Your intensity is your anointing. Your depth is your ministry. Your particular way of perceiving what others do not perceive is precisely the type of perception that people in their most difficult moments need. And the spaces that have the capacity to receive all of that were built to welcome exactly what you are. They exist, they are waiting, and they cannot be found by the conformed version of you. They can only be found by the full version. Different, intense, deep, unexplained perhaps, but real and precious, and exactly what God intended to produce when He created you. What breaks you open is what lets the light in.